They don't need to lock you in a cage. They don't need to shout. They don't need to force, because they've already done something far more powerful. They've made you feel guilty. Guilty for saying no. Guilty for walking away. Guilty for putting yourself first. You think you're free. But every decision you make is filtered through an invisible prison. A cage made not of metal, but of emotional manipulation. And guilt is the key they use to keep you inside. You hesitate to choose your own peace because you were conditioned to believe that peace must be earned through suffering. You silence your truth because they taught you that honesty is hurtful and compliance is love. You stay in toxic situations because guilt whispers, "What if you're being selfish?" But here's the truth. Guilt is not always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's a symptom of control, a control so subtle, so invisible, that you don't even know you're under its spell. Because when guilt becomes a habit, you no longer need a manipulator. You become your own warden. And this is the trap that breaks most people. Not force, not fear, but guilt. It's the perfect weapon. It disguises control as kindness. It makes you question your own sanity, and it convinces you that your suffering is your moral obligation. But here's the truth. You don't owe anyone your silence, your exhaustion, or the destruction of your spirit. Not for their comfort, not for their ego. It's time to reclaim your peace. In this video, we'll expose the architecture of guilt manipulation, how it's installed, how it's reinforced, and most importantly, how to break it without apology. Because when you strip away the emotional noise, you'll see the truth. They never had power over you. They only had guilt. And once you remove that, you become untouchable. Let's begin. Part 1. How guilt becomes a psychological weapon. Guilt was never just a feeling. It was designed to be a weapon, because unlike force, guilt doesn't trigger rebellion. It triggers compliance. When someone uses guilt to control you, they don't have to argue. They don't have to threaten. They just need to plant a seed. If you don't do this, you're a bad person, and you will do the rest. You'll overthink. You'll self-attack. You'll bend yourself into emotional knots, trying to avoid the shame. Guilt is self-sustaining. It makes you punish yourself for disappointing others, turning you into your own manipulator. And here's the twist. The more empathy you have, the more easily you're controlled by guilt. Because manipulators don't target the heartless. They target the kind, the sensitive, the ones who care too much. They use your goodness against you. They don't need to dominate you with power. They dominate you with emotional pressure. They say things like, "I guess I just don't matter to you anymore. I thought you were different. After everything I've done for you." It sounds like disappointment, but it's engineered to activate guilt, to make you feel like a villain just for having boundaries. You start doing things not because you want to, but because you feel bad if you don't. That's not choice. That's psychological control. And it runs deep, because once guilt enters your emotional system, it overrides logic. It overrides self-respect. It overrides truth. You can know something is wrong and still do it just to avoid feeling guilty. That's how powerful this weapon is. Because guilt doesn't just shape behavior, it rewires identity. It convinces you that being a good person means suffering quietly, that love means obedience, that your needs are a burden and your voice is a threat. And once that script takes root, you don't even need a manipulator anymore. You'll guilt yourself into submission. But here's the shift. Guilt is not always a moral compass. Sometimes it's emotional blackmail, disguised as love. And if you don't see the difference, you'll spend your entire life paying debts you never owed. Part 2. The hidden language of guilt manipulators. Guilt manipulators don't shout. They don't need to, because the most effective control doesn't sound aggressive. It sounds disappointed. It sounds subtle. It sounds almost loving. But behind that softness is a sharp blade, a weapon disguised as care, a trap dressed as tenderness. Listen closely to their language, because guilt is rarely direct. It's coated in emotional suggestion. They say, "I guess I'll just handle it myself. I didn't want to bother you. I know you're busy. I just thought you cared more. I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed." These aren't requests. They're traps designed to make you question yourself, to force self-correction. That's how guilt manipulation works. They don't ask you to do something. They make you feel like you should have done it already. They never tell you you're wrong. They just act like you failed them. And because you've been conditioned to seek approval, you jump in to fix what was never broken. You apologize for things you didn't do. You overcompensate for feelings they never expressed directly. You bend over backward just to feel like you're enough again. That's not communication. That's emotional conditioning. Even silence becomes a tactic. They withhold affection, withdraw energy, create emotional distance without saying a word, and you feel it. You internalize it. You start asking yourself, what did I do wrong? How do I fix this? How do I make it up to them? But here's the truth. They don't want resolution. They want submission. They want you in a constant state of self-blame, because a guilty mind is an obedient mind. And when you live under this kind of control long enough, you don't even wait for guilt to be triggered. You live in a pre-guilt state, constantly overthinking how not to disappoint others. That's the real trap. You become the manipulator's best weapon by policing yourself. But guilt is not always a signal that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that you're finally doing something right for yourself. Part 3. Why you keep submitting even when you know it's wrong. You've had those moments, the ones where your logic screams, "This isn't right," but still, you say yes. You stay, you comply, you tolerate. Why? Because guilt bypasses logic. It hijacks your nervous system before thought can intervene. You weren't taught to trust your boundaries. You were trained to fear hurting others, even when the situation is toxic. Even when you're exhausted, even when you know you're being used. Guilt whispers louder than truth. And that's not a weakness. That's programming. From the very beginning, you were conditioned to equate compliance with goodness. You were praised for being quiet, rewarded for being agreeable, loved only when you were convenient. The moment you challenged that pattern, you didn't just break a rule. You threatened the emotional order that held the system together. So what did they do? They didn't punish you with anger. They punished you with guilt. And now, even as an adult, you still flinch emotionally, not when someone yells, but when someone withdraws affection, when someone implies you've disappointed them, when someone acts hurt by your freedom. That's the invisible leash. That's the emotional conditioning loop. You mistake their discomfort for your guilt. You confuse rejection with moral failure. You think standing up for yourself is cruelty, but it's not cruelty. It's clarity. What's cruel is a system that trains you to feel bad for choosing yourself. What's cruel is teaching you that self-respect is selfishness. And that system isn't just external, it's internalized. You're not just fighting others anymore, you're fighting your own guilt script. That's why you keep submitting. Not because you agree, but because you're wired to appease before you think. Until that script is rewritten, You will keep trading your peace for someone else's comfort. But here's the shift. Your clarity must become stronger than your guilt, because guilt is not proof that you're wrong. Sometimes, guilt is the cost of breaking old chains. Part 4. Emotional loyalty versus personal sovereignty. There's a reason why you hesitate to walk away. Even when you know they're toxic, even when you know the pattern is destroying you, it's not because you love them. It's because you feel loyal to their emotions. You were taught that being a good person means staying quiet, staying available, staying in pain, so others can feel secure. But this isn't love. This is emotional loyalty, a silent contract you never signed, but one you've been obeying all your life. You've been conditioned to believe, if you walk away, you're cruel. If you set boundaries, you're selfish. If you choose peace, you're betraying them. That's how guilt sustains emotional loyalty. Not through love, but through obligation. But here's the truth no one tells you. Loyalty without respect is slavery, and emotional loyalty without sovereignty is self-destruction. They don't want your love. They want your compliance. They don't want your truth. They want your silence. And the moment you begin to detach, they'll weaponize guilt like never before. They'll say, "You've changed. You used to care more. You think you're better now." No, you're not better. You're just no longer controllable. And that scares them, because your sovereignty exposes their dependency on your submission. Your clarity disrupts the emotional hierarchy they built to keep you below them. But personal sovereignty isn't a rebellion. It's a return to self-command. It's knowing that your peace is not negotiable, that your voice is not up for debate, that your worth is not measured by how much guilt you can carry. You don't need to explain. You don't need to justify. You don't owe emotional loyalty to those who thrive on your self-abandonment. Because the highest form of love is not obedience, it's truth. And if your truth threatens them, let it. Because you're not here to preserve comfort. You're here to claim freedom. Part 5. How to break the guilt loop and take back control. You've seen the pattern. You've felt the trap. Now comes the shift that changes everything. You don't eliminate guilt by pleasing others. You eliminate guilt by rejecting the script. Because guilt isn't a signal that you've failed. It's a signal that you're finally breaking their control. Here's how to dismantle the loop. Step by step. Step 1. Name the programming. When guilt rises, don't suppress it, decode it. Ask yourself, who benefits when I feel this way? Whose approval am I still chasing? That guilt doesn't belong to you. It was implanted. Step 2. Reject the role of the good one. You were trained to overgive, to absorb pain, to prove your worth through suffering. Now it's time to drop that identity. Being a good person doesn't mean being emotionally enslaved. Step 3. Stop over-explaining. Every time you justify yourself, you reinforce the guilt. Instead, own your choices fully. Stop feeding that reflex. Learn to say, "This is my choice. Period." Your peace needs no permission. Step 4. Return guilt to its sender. When they say, "After all I've done for you," don't absorb it. Think, that's their guilt, not mine. You are not responsible for their emotional reactions. Step 5. Act from clarity, not guilt. Before every decision, pause and ask, is this coming from truth or guilt? Let your behavior follow sovereignty, not programming. And yes, at first, it will feel uncomfortable. Your nervous system will panic. Guilt will rise louder, begging you to go back to the old pattern. Don't. That's not a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're breaking the leash. Hold the line. The longer you resist emotional blackmail, the weaker its grip becomes. Because guilt is not proof that you're a bad person. It's proof that you've been emotionally conditioned. And now, you're unconditioning yourself. You're returning to clarity, to calm, to command. You're not cold, you're just clean, free of their residue, their expectations, their need to keep you small. You don't owe anyone your suffering. You were not born to suffer for their comfort. You were not born to silence yourself for their approval. You were not born to carry guilt for choosing your truth. If someone only loves you when you feel guilty, that's not love. That's control, and it ends here. Because you no longer belong to a system where pain equals virtue, where obedience equals goodness, where silence equals loyalty. You were trained to feel guilty for leaving what hurt you, but what you should feel is proud. Proud for breaking the cycle. Proud for putting clarity above obligation. Proud for choosing self-respect over emotional slavery. They will say you've changed. They will say you've lost your heart. They will say you've become cold, number. You've just become clear. Clear about what's manipulation. Clear about what's love. Clear about who you are, without the noise of their expectations. And in that clarity, there is power. The kind of power they can't touch. The kind of peace they can't disturb. The kind of freedom that comes from knowing you no longer owe anyone your suffering. Because guilt dies in truth. And the truth is this: you are not a bad person for choosing boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting your energy. You are not cruel for walking away. You are awake. You are sovereign. You are no longer programmable. This is not rebellion. This is self-command. When you stop fearing guilt, you become unstoppable. Let them call you cold. Let them call you distant. Let them call you selfish. Because from now on, you answer to one voice only, your own, and that voice is finally free.